The day broke scarlet over the port of Canton, casting an ominous glow across the bustling docks where the grand Chinese Caravel waited like a resting dragon. Sailors moved swiftly, hoisting barrels, tying ropes, and securing supplies with practiced urgency. The air was thick with the scents of spices, lacquered wood, and ocean salt. Towering above the harbor, the ship's sails shimmered slightly in the morning wind, ready to embrace the long voyage ahead. Everyone knew the risks. They might not see home again for years, ever. On the upper deck, Commander Li Wei stood over a wide table of hand-drawn maps, plotting routes with unerring precision. He traced invisible lines across parchment, murmuring the names of distant ports and unpredictable currents. His eyes, steady and wise, held the memory of countless voyages through both calm and chaos. Every man on board trusted him. He didn't speak often, but when he did, carried the gravity of the sea itself. Among the new recruits was a boy of 16 named Zihao, eyes full of wonder and fire. This was his first time at sea, and the thrill coursed through his veins. Like lightning, his hands shook slightly as he carried bundles of rice aboard, but his steps were purposeful. To him, this voyage was more than a journey, was a calling, a sacred test of courage and destiny. He dreamed of returning one day, with stories only the ocean could tell. Families gathered near the docks, waving cloths and weeping softly. Children clung to mothers while wives pressed letters into the hands of departing husbands. Farewells were exchanged in whispers, in silence, and in desperate embraces. The knowledge that these ships often vanished into nothingness hung heavily in the humid morning air. But still, they sailed for duty, for trade, for glory, and sometimes for escape. Then came the cry, "Raise anchor." Like a heartbeat, the command rippled through the ship. Chains clanked and creaked. The giant sails unfurled with a rush of wind, catching the morning light like wings of silk. Slowly, gracefully, the vessel drifted away from the dock, its hull cutting through the waves with the elegance of a whale. Canton shrank behind them, the land becoming a memory almost too quickly as the shoreline disappeared into the haze. A hush fell over the crew. The only sounds were the groan of timber, the snap of sails, and the hush of waves lapping against the hull. Men stood quietly, letting the rhythm of the sea seep into their bones. For some, it was familiar. For others, like Zihao, it was terrifying and beautiful all at once. The open ocean welcomed them without promise or mercy. Night came swiftly. Stars pierced the darkening sky as the ship continued its steady course eastward. Below deck, hammocks swung gently, creaking like lullabies. On the deck, Li Wei stood alone at the helm, the moon casting his shadow far and long. Thus began the voyage, not just across the seas, but into legend, where maps faded and stories endured. Asterisks, the first few days on the open sea were an initiation. The vast blue horizon stretched endlessly in every direction, reminding every sailor that they were now part of something far larger than themselves. The ship's routines took hold quickly, like the cadence of a drumbeat. At dawn, the crew was already in motion, scrubbing the deck with seawater, reinforcing knots, inspecting sails for wear. Each man had his place, his duties, timed like a ceremony. Discipline was not optional here. It was the only way to survive. Meals were simple but nourishing. Rice steamed with dried fish, preserved vegetables, and sometimes a fruit saved from port. The cook station, nestled near the rear of the lower deck, became a sacred site of warmth and comfort. Hot soup on a cold morning could lift spirits like nothing else. The crew gathered around in shifts, sharing bowls, laughter, and even stories from their provinces. Though strangers at first, camaraderie blossomed in the simplicity of shared survival. During the afternoons, Commander Li Wei organized drills, rope climbing, sword training, and even archery. They practiced boarding defense and emergency response to fire. Young C. Howe trained furiously, determined to earn the respect of the elder seamen. Sweat dripped from his brow, his muscles aching from effort, but his mind absorbed every motion, every instruction. These weren't just exercises. They were rituals of resilience, carved into their very bodies. When the sun began to descend, the tone aboard changed. The crew would gather on the deck, watching the sky melt into orange and violet. Musicians among them would play the creaking, or bamboo flutes, and others would chant old sea ballads that spoke of dragons in the deep and kingdoms lost to waves. See Howe listened with wonder, letting each word sink in as if they were spells. The stories of the sea, after all, were more enduring than the maps. Maintenance was constant. Carpentry crews inspected the wooden planks daily, tapping for hollow sounds, sealing the slightest cracks with resin and cloth. Rope masters checked and rechecked every knot, and younger crew members were taught how to detect decay in the thick canvas sails. Even the iron parts of the ship were polished and protected against salt corrosion. The ship was a living thing and, like any being, it needed care, vigilance, and reverence. Night watches were sacred and solitary. The appointed sailors moved like shadows on the deck, eyes scanning the sea and sky for signs of change. They kept the fire lanterns low and there, ears sharp. Sometimes, far in the distance, they saw other lights, flicking known ships perhaps, or phantom fires. The sea was as much mystery as it was rude. And within those silent hours, men whispered prayers, asking the stars for safe passage and the ancestors for protection at the cusp of each dawn. The cycle began again. The sea had no memory of yesterday, and the ship pressed forward through its forgetfulness. There were no weekends, no holidays, only wind and water, and the task of keeping the vessel and the hearts aboard it whole. Slowly, the crew shed their land-born ways. They became part of the ocean tide-bound and salt-breathed sons of the vast unknown. Asterisk on the 14th day. The skies turned gray in a way that felt unnatural. The air thickened with humidity, and the gulls disappeared. Way, standing at the helm, narrowed his eyes and scanned the horizon. "Storm," he murmured. The word passed among the sailors like lightning down a chain. All conversations stopped. They knew what was coming and what it would demand. Storms in the southern sea did not arrive gently. They announced themselves like beasts. Every hand aboard leaped into action. Sails were pulled down and secured. Loose cargo was fastened with double ropes. The ship was battened down, every hatch sealed tight. See Howe moved with nervous precision, copying the older sailors. His hands fumbled, but grew steadier with each knot. Above, clouds black as ink rolled over them, swallowing the sky. The sea began to rise, swelling beneath them with silent fury. When the storm hit, it did not ask permission. The first wave crashed into the hull with deafening power, sending a spray that soaked even those below deck. The wind howled like 1,000 wolves, slamming into the sails, rattling every joint of the wooden beast. Thunder cracked in the heavens, and rain lashed like whips across their faces. The ship creaked and groaned as if it were alive, protesting each blow from the elements. Lee Way stood unmoving at the helm, drenched and unshaken. His voice rose above the chaos, issuing commands that were obeyed without hesitation. His calm held the crew together like the ship's spine. Meanwhile, See Howe clung to the mainmast, heart pounding, vision blurred by salt water. But somewhere inside, the fear, something awakened an instinct, a rhythm. He began to move with the ship, not against it, his body learning the truth that only storms could teach. For hours, they fought against the monstrous sea. At times, the ship tilted so far that the edge of the deck dipped into the ocean. Barrels tumbled. Men were thrown, caught only by their lions or comrades. Yet they endured, kata to one another through the wind, tied each other down, and worked with a fierce unity born of necessity. The ship held. The crew held. And the sea finally began to relent. By dawn, the skies cleared as if nothing had happened. The sea stilled, eerily calm after its violence. The ship bore scars, splintered rails, soaked canvas, exhausted souls, but it still floated. Li Wei gathered the men and gave thanks to heaven, to their ancestors, and to the ship itself. There was no ceremony, no feast, quiet nods, the tightening of ropes, and the slow resumption of routine. That was how sailors survive storms, not with glory, but with grit. That night, the stars returned. Hao stood on deck, his hands blistered, clothes torn, but his spirit transformed. The sea had tested him and had not broken him. He looked at Li Wei, now not as a distant commander, but as a master of balance between chaos and order. And in that moment, Zihao Nui would not just survive this journey, he will become part of the ocean's song. After the storm, the ocean gave them peace of silence, so vast it felt sacred. It was in this stillness that the crew fell back into their rhythm, perhaps stronger than before. Each man now carried with him the memory of the tempest, stitched into his bones like a secret lesson. Li Wei resumed his nightly star watches, inviting select crew to learn the art of celestial navigation. It was not simply science, it was reverence. Each night, he stood at the bow with his celestial maps spread on silk parchment. The stars above guided their course, and he taught them to read not only Polaris and Orion, but also how the movement of the moon and tilt of the waves told stories. Zihao listened with awe, realizing how the cosmos was like an ancient compass only a few knew how to hear. We follow not just stars, Li Wei whispered once. We follow memory. By day, the crew repaired damaged ropes and sails. Blacksmiths hammered iron rings back into place, and carpenters smoothed cracked beams. The ship healed slowly, groaning occasionally like an old man stretching after sleep. In quieter moments, the crew sang working songs to lighten the labor, filling the space between hammer strikes and rope pulls with rhythm and memory. Work became meditation. In the afternoons, those who could read were seen studying ancient texts and maps in corners of the ship. Some scrolls were philosophical treatises from Confucian sages. Others contained navigation routes etched in fading ink from centuries past. Li Wei encouraged this. He believed that an educated sailor was a wise one. Zihao, though unlettered, watched closely, memorizing symbols and listening to every spoken word as if it were scripture. As the days passed, the ocean revealed its softer side. Dolphins followed their wake, leaping joyfully beside the vessel. Flying fish shot from the surface like arrows. The sea turned crystal blue, the wind gentle, and the sails full but calm. It was a time of recovery, of regaining strength, not just in body, but in spirit. The storm was behind them, but the journey was far from over. Evenings were filled with stories. Veterans told tales of ghost ships, sunken kingdoms, and dragons that guarded hidden ports. See, Hal began to share to his voice, hesitant at first, but growing bolder. His tale of surviving the storm earned him nods of respect from the older men. He was no longer just a boy from the inland provinces. He was now one of the my child of the sea. And as stars began to scatter again across the dark sky, the Caravel pressed forward, deeper into the unknown. Every night became a promise, and every wave a whisper. They were not just sailing, they were writing their names in the silence between constellations. Asterisk, at dawn. A cry erupted from the lookout post. Ships on the horizon. The crew sprang into action, rushing to the railings to spot the approaching silhouettes. Commander Li Wei calmly lifted his bronze spyglass, scanning the distant sails cutting through the sea. The shapes were small, unfamiliar, possibly local, traders, but caution reigned. The ocean was lawless in many places, and a smiling ship could hide sharpened daggers. He lowered the glass and gave his order. Be alert, be silent, be ready. Mariners dashed to their stations. Spears and bows were readied, but hidden from view. Their stance was one of friendly openness with silent strength. The wind pressed gently into the sails as the smaller vessels drew near. Seahow's pulse raced his first close encounter with outsiders. Were they friendly? Hostile? The boy stood amongst seasoned sailors, watching their body language more than their words. He felt the unspoken tension ripple across the deck like a wave. The vessels slowed, now close enough for voices to carry. From their decks, dark-skinned men in bright cloths waved peacefully. They called out in a language that a few crew members recognized traders from the Sunda Islands. Li Wei raised his hand, signaling for a cautious welcome. Ropes were tossed, and soon the smaller boats were tied alongside. The visitors climbed aboard with careful steps, hands open, eyes curious. The ship once again became a stage for exchange, curiosity, and diplomacy. Within minutes, the deck transformed into a floating market. Silks, ceramics, and copper tools were laid out by the Chinese sailors. In return, the islanders brought sweet fruits, fragrant woods, and carved idols of curious design. They spoke through gestures, drawings on wood, and shared laughter. It was clumsy at times, but it worked. See how watched in fascination. This wasn't war, nor conquest. It was a dance between strangers under the same sun, bound by trade and wonder. He wandered near a man who played a reed flute unlike any he had ever heard. The melody was light, flickering like the leaves of a banyan tree. Zihao offered him a hand-carved comb from his hometown, and a man, smiling wide, gave him a small stone figurine in return. The boy held it tightly. In that moment, he understood what true connection meant. Not language, not similarity, but the shared spirit of exploration. Li Wei, however, remained vigilant. He counted every head aboard, every pouch exchanged, and never let the visitors wander freely. He knew that peace was always a tide it could turn, okay? But when the sun reached its peak and the traders prepared to leave, no misstep had occurred. With mutual bows and grateful smiles, the ships separated, disappearing back into the scent of spices and memory. That night, as the Caravel resumed its silent voyage, the crew felt changed. They had seen another world in miniature, touched another life. See how sat with his figurine in hand and thought not of danger, but of possibility. The sea no longer frightened him. It whispered promises of new lands, friendships, and stories yet to be lived. He was ready for more. Days later, another cry echoed from the mastland. This time, a series of emerald islands rose from the morning fog, their cliffs sharp, their shores lined with lush, untamed jungle. The sea glimmered with coral reefs beneath the surface, and birds the size of banners circled overhead. Li Wei reviewed his maps carefully. The archipelago was marked only in legend, supposedly home to kind tribes, sweet water, and fruits that cured illness. It was too tempting to ignore. The ship slowed, navigating carefully through narrow passages of reef and rock. Finally, they dropped anchor in a shallow bay where white sand met the jungle's edge. A delegation went ashore, led by Li Wei himself. Drummers and dancers greeted them, locals in brightly dyed cloths, adorned with shells and feathered ornaments. They carried no weapons, only gifts, woven baskets of fruit, jugs of fresh water, and garlands of flowers. The crew relaxed, but not completely. Seahouse stepped onto land with trembling knees. The earth felt strange after so long on shifting wood. He bent to touch the sand, marveling at its warmth. The locals smiled at him and offered him coconut water, which he drank gratefully. around him. The island buzzed with color, scent, and bird call. It felt like walking inside a painting, one that smelled of citrus and salt. He followed the others toward the village, eyes wide with curiosity. For 3 days, the crew rested and replenished their stores. The islanders showed them how to catch fish with nets woven from vines and how to find freshwater pools hidden deep in the jungle. In return, the Chinese sailors repaired a canoe for them and gifted sharpened tools. Songs were exchanged around fires at night. The barriers of language dissolved into rhythm and gesture. Zi Hao learned the name of the island, Sukara. It meant island that watches. Despite the peace, Li Wei remained cautious. He posted guards in shifts and insisted on daily check-ins. He studied the stars each night to ensure they could depart at the right time. A good commander never let comfort dull awareness. He had seen too many voyages lost to overconfidence. Still, he allowed the crew time to smile, to swim, to remember why they had left home in the first place, not only for trade, but for life. On the morning of departure, the islanders gave parting gifts, rare blue fruit, medicinal herbs, and a carved plank with a constellation map only their shamans knew. In return, Li Wei left them with silk and scrolls of poetry written in calligraphy. There were hugs, tears, and long looks back. Zi Hao stood at the railing as the island shrank behind them, a part of him aching to stay, but another part thrilled to go, venture, waited beyond every wave. That night, he placed the plank with the constellation carvings under his hammock and stared at the stars. The world was larger than he'd ever imagined. The sea was not empty. It was filled with people, stories, and invisible threads that tied distant hearts together. And he was one of them now, a thread, a wanderer, a dreamer aboard a floating kingdom. The calm sea turned dark again, this time not with clouds, but with depth. The waters thickened, the color shifting to black-blue, the waves heavier. The crew murmured about entering the deep belt of place sailors feared and respected. Fish disappeared. Even birds grew sparse. The air was thick with pressure, and the sun felt distant. Li Wei called for quiet on deck. "This is a place of memory," he said. "Treat it like a shrine." The wind blew low and constant, humming like a ghost. At night, strange sounds echoed from the depths, clicks, howls, and groans, as if the sea itself spoke in sleep. Some sailors refused to speak after sunset. Others tied charms around their wrists. Even the strongest men kept lanterns close. Di was no longer friend or foe, was something else entirely, ancient, vast, and watching. No one disobeyed orders here. One night, the ship rocked with a sudden force-no storm. No wind, a single, massive wave. Panic erupted, but Li Wei calmed them instantly. "It is only the sea reminding us," he said. He offered incense at the bow, letting it drift across the surface. That night, the noises stopped. Silence returned, but heavier than before. Zi Hao lay awake in his hammock, clutching the constellation, plank from Sukara like a talisman. The following days were quiet but tense. The crew whispered about dragons, leviathans, and old gods buried in the ocean floor. Zi Hao asked an older sailor about it, and the man simply said, "The ocean forgets nothing. That's why we honor it." It wasn't fear that gripped the crew, it was reverence. They had passed into sacred territory, and each man carried himself with the humility of a monk inside a temple. To ease tension, Li Wei held a night of silence. No talking, no instruments, just stillness and observation. The crew sat on deck, watching the stars reflect in the black water. Even breathing felt louder than usual, and somehow the ritual worked. The fear softened. The ship, though small in the vastness, felt protected. as if the sea acknowledged their humility and offered safe passage in return. Finally, after 6 days, the color of the water began to shift. Again blue returned, and with it, the songs of birds. Flying fish leapt across the waves. The deep belt had released them. Cheers erupted on the deck, but only briefly. "Lee," we reminded them with a raised hand. "We thank the sea. We never celebrate its silence." Heads bowed. Offerings were made. The chapter had closed, and none would forget it. That evening, its red clouds lit the horizon. See how stood at the bow, wind brushing his cheeks. He felt not older, but deeper like. The sea had poured something into him. Wisdom, perhaps, or simply perspective. He no longer feared what lay ahead. He respected it. With every breath, he felt more like a sailor, not just in body, but in soul. Asterisk, as the Caravel glided through gentler waters, the sea began to speak again, with waves or storms, but with currents that whispered stories through the wood of the ship. The crew felt it in their feet, a vibration beneath the planks. Leeway called them memory lines, hidden routes that connected ancient ports and places long erased from maps. He explained that the Chinese had sailed these paths for generations, tracing the veins of the earth as if reading the palm of the ocean each morning. The helmsmen adjusted their course by feeling the currents, not by sight. The rudder responded as if guided by unseen hands, and the sails swelled with wind from unknown origins. The ship moved faster, but more smoothly. No resistance, no pull. The sailors called it riding the dragon's back. Some believed spirits of past captains guided them. Others said it was simply good fortune. Zi Hao, however, believed it was trust. The sea was learning their names. Birds returned in great numbers, herons, terns, and albatrosses that followed them for hours. Their cries echoed over the deck like omens. Leeway paid attention to their patterns, using them to anticipate weather shifts. When birds flew low and silent, he ordered preparation for rain. When they circled high and loudly, he called for celebration. The sky was no longer a stranger. It was part of the crew, another set of eyes watching ahead. Food became more plentiful again. The sea gifted them with easy catches nets filled with gleaming silver fish, and at times flying fish that landed directly on deck. The cook smiled. More often now, preparing stews and even occasional sweet rice from saved rations. Meals became a time of laughter again, and even the older sailors joined in singing. See Hao learned sea songs from the southern province's melodies he would never forget. Now sewn into his memory with salt and wind, the journey began to feel enchanted. The water shimmered with bioluminescent, stunning, glowing creatures that sparkled beneath the hull. The crew watched with awe as the ship carved a glowing path through the night. Every movement of the rudder lit up like a brushstroke on a dark canvas. They whispered legends of water spirits dancing, of ancestors walking beside them in the sea's glow. It was not fearsome, it was beautiful. See Hao began keeping a secret journal, carving symbols in short lines into a bamboo scroll he hid in his bedding. Recorded stars he saw, the direction of winds, and feelings he couldn't explain. Became a way of understanding his transformation. The boy who had stepped aboard weeks ago had changed. His hands were rough, his mind sharp, and his heart open to wonders he never imagined existed. He had become a student of the sea. By the time the currents shifted and slowed, the crew was ready. They had ridden a ribbon of memory through the ocean, and now land loomed again in the distance. But this time, they didn't cheer. They stood silently, watching the silhouette grow dark mountains against a purple sky. Whatever waited there, they would face together. It's a brotherhood carved by storms, stars, and salt. Asterisk, the land that rose before them was nothing like the lush islands they had visited. This coast was steep, jagged, and shadowed by mist. The mountains came straight down into the sea like black teeth, and the trees near the shore were twisted by wind. Li Wei ordered caution. "This is no place of welcome," he said softly, "but it is part of the map, and we must learn from it." The ship anchored in a natural inlet protected by high cliffs. A scouting party, including Zihao, descended into the rocky cove, their feet crunching on dark sand and sharp stone. They found signs of habitation, charred wood, broken tools, and totems carved with strange animal shapes. No people, no voices, just the wind and the sound of waves slapping against a rock. The place felt paused, not abandoned, but waiting. They climbed a narrow trail up the slope, guided by instinct more than direction. At the top, they found a plateau covered in wild grass and old stone markers. One sailor whispered that they were graves, but Li Wei shook his head. "These are memories carved into the earth, not to mourn, but to mark." He knelt and touched the stones, whispering words in his native dialect. "Respect, always." As they returned to the cove, the mist thickened. Visibility dropped, and the group moved closer together. See how heard a low hum, like singing from beneath the ground. Others heard it too, but no one spoke of it aloud. Some places, Li Wei later explained, carry echoes of the past. "Sometimes," he said, "land remembers the ones who walked before us, and sometimes it speaks." They left offerings before boarding again, rice, incense, and coins. The ship pulled away slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the air. The mist followed them out to sea, clinging to the sails until morning. When it finally lifted, the crew remained quiet, as though waking from a dream they couldn't quite explain. Zihao stared at the cliffs until they vanished, his thoughts heavy, but his heart calm. In his journal, he wrote no words that night, only a single symbol, a mountain with a spiral above it. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt true. Night, the stars were hidden, and the ship drifted silently forward. Some journeys don't offer answers, they offer presence, and sometimes that is enough. The crew slept deeply, rocked by gentle waves. Their dreams were strange, of drums, of stone paths, of voices that didn't use words. Whatever had passed between them and that island, it was part of their story now, etched not in ink, but in something older. The weather warmed, and the sea opened wide again. The sky turned a deeper blue, and the sun rose more boldly. They had entered the southern arc, a vast emptiness between great lands, where days stretched long, and the horizon rarely changed. It was a test of endurance, not of danger, but of repetition. Here, it was not the sea that challenged men, but the silence between each heartbeat. Li Wei changed their routines. He introduced midday meditation, where no one spoke for an hour. The deck became a temple, each man seated, cross-legged, breathing with the ship. Even the youngest sailors participated. Zihao found peace in those moments, breathing in the salt, listening to the creak of the mast. He began to understand that silence was not absence, but invitation. The sails filled steadily with warm wind. Birds circled above, but none landed. Some days, they saw no life at all. Blue, above, below, behind, ahead. Blue was hypnotic, even maddening. Some sailors began carving wood for hours just to keep their minds anchored. Others hummed songs with no words. Everyone found a way to stay present or to escape. One afternoon, Zihao spotted a pod of whales in the distance, massive, slow-moving shapes that breached and vanished. The crew fell into quiet reverence, watching them pass like living mountains. "They know the ocean better than we do," Li Wei said. "They've mapped it with memory." It was a moment of awe, a reminder that even in silence, greatness moved all around them. Food grew scarce again, But the crew adapted. Dried seaweed and salted beans became staples. Fresh water was rationed. No one complained. They had passed through fire and fog. They would pass through this too. In their hardship, there was solidarity. In the silence, they heard each other's breath. They were no longer a crew. They were a chorus. On the 40th day of the silent passage, land finally broke the horizon, again faint, golden, and full of possibility. The crew stood in quiet awe. No cheering, just eyes wide, hearts steady. They didn't know what waited, but they would arrive not as strangers, but as men transformed by sea and silence. That night, C. Howell wrote in his journal, "The sea is not just between lands. It is between who I was and who I am becoming." And as the ship glided toward the new shore, the wind behind them felt like a blessing. Asterisk, the land ahead shimmered like fire under the afternoon sun. Hills of red dust rolled into the distance, and tall palm trees marked the coastline like sentinels. As the caravel approached the shallows, the crew marveled at the richness of color, so different from the dark cliffs or verdant jungles they'd seen before. C. Howe leaned over the railing, breath caught in his throat. It felt like arriving on another planet, sculpted by the sun and guarded by silence. Lee Wei consulted ancient maps and frowned. "This coast isn't marked," he said. "It's not in any scroll I've read." That alone made the landing sacred. He ordered a respectful approach. No shouting, no drums, only careful movement and mindful steps. The anchor dropped slowly into clear water, and a small crew boarded rowboats to reach the beach. See How was chosen to go. His heart pounded, not with fear, but anticipation. The sand burned underfoot, but it was smooth and clean. They moved slowly, eyes scanning the hills for any movement. The air was thick with heat, and everything smelled of dust, salt, and unknown flowers. A strange silence hung in the air, as if the land itself was holding its breath. They found no signs of people, only stone pillars shaped like spirals and half-buried pottery, etched with symbols no one recognized. The crew began collecting soil and water samples while Li Wei sketched the carvings. See How wandered slightly apart, drawn to a flat stone slab halfway buried in the sand. He brushed off the surface, revealing a constellation pattern eerily similar to the one carved on his bamboo scroll. He ran to Li Wei, who stared at the symbols for a long time. "These are older than us," the commander whispered. "Older than our empires. Older than I see." No one spoke after that. They simply bowed and returned to the ship, each man carrying a fragment of mystery inside. Back aboard the Caravel, the crew was quieter than usual. That night, no songs were sung, only the soft sound of the water lapping against the hull, and the scribble of Li Wei's brush on his journal scroll. See How clutched the bamboo scroll to his chest, staring at the horizon. The idea that their voyage had touched something ancient and unknown filled him with awe. It was not fear, it was reverence. When the ship set sail the next morning, the wind came strong and steady, as if the land had blessed their departure. The water turned to golden green, and even the birds followed them briefly before peeling off toward the sky. Li Wei stood at the helm, longer than usual, eyes narrowed in deep thought. "We are not just voyaging across oceans," he said aloud. "We are voyaging across memory woven through time." See How wrote in his journal. "Some places are not on maps. Some places are inside us, waiting." And with that, he closed the scroll, tied it with silk, and slipped it into a wooden box. He didn't need to read it again. The land had written its story directly onto his heart. Asterisk, as they sailed farther south, the sky began to change. Nights grew brighter, the stars sharper, and the moon fuller than any they'd seen. One evening, it rose like a flaming coin over the horizon, red, immense, and pulsing. The oldest sailors froze, whispering old legends. "The fire moon," one said, "a sign of passage." Li Wei ordered a halt. "We mark this night," he declared. "It is not just the sea we cross. Tonight, we cross into spirit." A temporary camp was made on deck, and incense lit near the bow. The crew, dressed in red robes, carefully folded and stored for sacred occasions. Drums were brought out, but not for rhythm. They beat slowly, echoing the ship's pulse. Li Wei spoke softly about the ancestors, the forgotten gods of the deep, and the stars that remember us even when we forget them. Then he turned to the youngest crew members and said, "Tonight, you are no longer boys." See how felt tears rise. Unexpectedly, the fire moon bathed the entire deck in crimson light. Shadows danced on the sails, and the ship seemed to float not on water, but on flame. Each sailor placed an offering in a small wooden bowl, a lock of hair, a scrap of silk, a carved token, and set it adrift. The bowls floated like stars, carried silently away on the sea's breath. Later, as silence returned, the crew lay on the deck and stared at the sky. Stories were whispered not of war or glory, but of grandmothers, rivers, old dreams, and lost names. Even the most hardened sailors softened under that sky. The moon listened, and the sea did not speak, but held their stories like secrets in its depth. See how fell asleep there, under the open stars, with his head resting on a coiled rope. He dreamed of walking on the moon's surface, touching the stars with his fingertips. When he awoke, the moon was pale and low again, and the sky had turned gray-blue. He felt older, not in years, but in spirit, as if he had been initiated into something without knowing the name for it. Li Wei said little the next day. He simply nodded to each sailor, as if confirming their transformation. The ship moved forward gently, riding calm currents, but something had shifted. The voyage had crossed a spiritual threshold. The sea, now, was not just water, it was a mirror, and every man aboard was learning to see himself reflected in its endless surface. That evening, as the fire moon vanished, the crew returned to routine, but their movements were slower, more thoughtful. The world had not changed, but they had, forever. As the Caravel moved deeper into southern waters, new constellations began to appear, strange stars, unfamiliar to most of the crew. One stood out more than the rest, a perfect cross, bright and clear. Li Wei named it immediately the Southern Cross. It had guided many great sailors, and now it would guide them too. The crew gathered nightly to trace it in the sky, memorizing its place like children learning their names for the first time. Days passed in near silence, not by order, but by instinct. The ocean had grown gentle against swelling in long, slow waves that lulled the ship like a cradle. Even the wind whispered instead of howling. It was a rare and sacred stillness. The sea house spent hours on the forward deck, watching the water pass beneath them like silk. It was so clear he could see glowing fish far below, darting like stars in a world upside down. The crew adjusted their rhythm. Work was done with precision and grace, no shouting, no wasted motion. Meals were eaten quietly, with heads bowed and spoons raised slowly. At night, the silence was broken only by soft flutes or the creaking of the hull. It was as though the ship itself had learned to speak softly, honoring the quiet wisdom of the southern seas. One morning, the water around them turned a strange color blue, so deep it looked black. Some sailors murmured old superstitions, but Li Wei simply nodded. "The deep southern passage," he said. "The ocean is oldest here." He ordered a full deck cleaning and incense offerings at every mast. "We walk through sacred halls," he explained. "Tread lightly, even in water." Howe took out his scroll and carved the shape of the Southern Cross beside the mountain and the spiral. He didn't understand yet what these symbols meant together, but he felt them guiding him like keys to a door not yet opened. He had stopped trying to control the meaning. He was learning to listen. Instead, to the stars, to the sea, to his own breath. One afternoon, they passed a massive sea turtle, larger than any man, drifting alongside the ship. It looked up at them with ancient eyes, then slowly vanished beneath the surface. The crew bowed in silence. No one spoke of omens or luck. It simply was an encounter, sacred in its stillness. See how felt a connection, wordless but undeniable. The sea was teaching him patience, presence, and reverence. And when night fell again, the Southern Cross hung high above them, constant, unwavering. In the quiet that followed, every man aboard the Caravel felt something deeper than navigation. They felt alignment, not with maps or orders, but with the rhythm of the world itself. Asterix Land appeared without warning, an island shaped like a crescent moon, surrounded by water, so still it reflected the sky perfectly. As the Caravel approached, the horizon seemed to vanish, blending the ocean with the clouds. The crew stared in awe. The island had no cliffs, no visible settlements, only silver-white sand in shallow lagoons that shimmered like glass. "This is a place of reflection," whispered Leeway. "Not for conquest, for understanding." The crew disembarked quietly, as if afraid to disturb the perfect silence. Every step on the beach left sharp footprints in the powder-fine sand, which shimmered like crushed pearls. No birds cried. No waves broke. The sound of their breathing was louder than the sea. See, Hal stepped to the edge of the lagoon and stared at his own reflection, sunburned cheeks, longer hair, eyes darker than he remembered. He saw himself, yet not as a boy, not anymore. Scattered across the island were smooth, upright stones, some only knee-high, others taller than a man. They were arranged in circles and lines, pointing toward stars that hadn't yet risen. The crew studied them in silence, tracing the patterns with bare hands, sensing something older than language written in their placement. It was as though the island itself was an altar, waiting to be understood, but never demanding it. A temple without walls. Leeway allowed the crew to spend the day scattered across the land. Some meditated beside the standing stones. Others walked into the warm, shallow water to feel it swirl around their feet. Hal sat alone beneath a small tree with silver-green leaves. Listened not with ears, but with presence, he thought, about everything the sea had shown him. And for once, he had no questions, only stillness. At sunset, something changed. The wind shifted, and clouds turned golden. The lagoon lit up with orange and violet hues, and their reflections danced on the wet sand. The crew gathered at the shore, forming a circle without command. Leeway stepped into the center and bowed low, offering a small bow. When it rang, it sounded like light. No one spoke. No one needed to. That night, they slept on the beach under open skies. Hal dreamed of standing stones humming with stars inside them, of voices that sounded like wind through reeds. When he awoke, dawn was gray and soft, and the lagoon had returned to its mirror-stilled silence. Without needing instruction, the crew packed quietly and returned to the Caravel. The island had changed them, and they carried that silence back with them as the sails caught the wind again. No one looked back, not because they had forgotten, but because they knew that place was no longer behind them. It was within them now, a mirrored stillness carved into the soul, where one day, when the sea grew quiet again, they would return in memory and in dream. 2 days after leaving the mirrored island, the sea turned restless again. The skies remained clear, but the wind began to twist, curling in odd directions. The crew felt it first in their bones of tension, a weight behind the eyes. Leeway ordered changes in sail position and pace. "We are entering old waters," he warned, "where truth and illusion braid together. Stay focused, stay quiet." That night, a strange sound echoed across the waves of song, distant and high, like crystal breaking gently. It wasn't a storm, nor a bird. It was music, but without instruments. Crew froze, crossed themselves. Others reached for CHARMS. See How felt his chest tighten, not in fear, but in recognition. The sound felt familiar, like a memory he had never lived. Li Wei stood motionless at the helm, his knuckles white on the wheel. The music grew louder, then softer, then vanished entirely. No one could locate its source. The sea remained calm, but the silence afterward was heavy. That evening, Li Wei called a full crew gathering. We heard what others never do, he said. The sea remembers those who try to forget her. She sings to remind us, not all beauty is invitation. Not all wonder is safety. The next day, the current became chaotic waves, pushing from different directions, swimming in tight spirals beneath the hull. The Caravel rocked with strange rhythm, as if dancing to a song no longer heard. See How helped adjust the ropes, his hands raw and eyes wide. He understood now why the older sailors didn't talk about this part of the journey. There were no words that could make sense of the sea's moods. By dusk, thick fog rolled in, and vision dropped to mere feet. Lanterns were lit, and the ship moved slowly. No one slept that night. They rotated shifts, always 2 at the bow, 2 on the main mast, and Li Wei awake at the helm. See How joined the watch, his heart pounding with each creak of the wood. Yet, the fog never revealed a threat, It just lingered in embrace of uncertainty, classing into the bones. In the early morning hours, the fog lifted as suddenly as it came. The sea calmed, the sun rose red and unwavering. A flock of birds flew overhead, and the crew exhaled in unison. Li Wei finally spoke again. The sea tested our minds, not our strength. Kay bowed slightly toward the horizon, and we passed. For now, See How wrote only a single word in his scroll that day. Voice. He didn't understand the full meaning yet, but he knew he would one day. Maybe not on this voyage. Maybe not in this life. But somewhere, the sea would teach him. The rest? The heat began to build. Each morning felt heavier, and each breath seemed thicker than the last. Li Wei stood at the bow each dawn, reading the sky with increasing caution. Monsoon season approaches, he warned, and we are near its edge. The crew tightened every rope twice over, reinforced barrels, and moved all valuables below deck. The ship needed to become a fortress. The sea was about to test them again, not with illusions, but with force. Clouds formed like bruises across the sky, slow and patient. The wind came in pulses, soft, then hard, then soft again, like a predator studying its prey. The first rain came warm and light, almost pleasant. Li Wei's silence told a different story. This is not rain, he murmured. This is the breath before the roar. The crew moved like shadows, efficient and without complaint. They had learned fear was a distraction. Preparation was strength. That night, storm arrived, and no poet could ever do it justice. Winds howled like dragons, tearing the sky apart. Rain slammed down in sheets, blinding the eyes and freezing the skin. The Caravel bucked like a wild beast, rising on monstrous waves only to crash into valleys of darkness. The sails snapped, masts bent, and ropes screamed against wood. But the crew moved like one body, each man trusting the next, each hand working in rhythm with the storm. See How held onto the mast with everything he had. Lightning split the sky, revealing the fear in every face and the courage just beneath it. He couldn't hear anything except the roar of wind and the shouts of sailors. Yet he felt a strange calm rise in him. He was not alone. He was part of the storm now, part of the ship, part of the fury and the defiance. For hours, they fought against the sea, the sky, and their own limits. At one point, A wave taller than a temple crashed over the deck, washing 2 men overboard. They were pulled back by ropes in seconds. No one was lost. Not yet, but everyone knew the storm wasn't finished. It had only paused to breathe. By dawn, the winds slowed. The rain softened, and the ship, broken in places but still floating, drifted in the silence that always follows catastrophe. Li Wei finally allowed himself to sit. His hands were bleeding, but he smiled. "We have passed through the fire of the south," he said. "Now we rebuild." See How sat beside a broken barrel and looked up at the sky, now pink and tired. He whispered, "Thank you, we didn't know." But the sea had heard. Asterisk, the storm had passed, but it left behind wounds in every corner of the Caravel. Sails were torn like old scrolls, wooden railings splintered, ropes frayed and soaked beyond use. But the crew did not mourn the damage. I moved into repair mode with quiet determination. This ship was not just wood and canvas, okay? It was their shelter, their lifeline, their voice in the vast ocean. Every blow it took was personal, and every repair was an act of loyalty. Li Wei organized the recovery like a military campaign. Carpenters began replacing beams by sunrise. Sailmakers spread cloth across the deck, stitching patches by hand. How joined a crew assigned to clean the lower decks, bailing out water, drying stores, checking for rot. Okay, the air below was thick and musty, but it carried the scent of survival. They had been to the brink and now they were coming back stronger. Food was rationed strictly. Several barrels of rice had spoiled in the flooding, and their dried fruit reserves had shrunk. Right. No one complained. Hunger was easier to bear than helplessness. Each meal shared became a ritual of resilience. Bowls clinked gently in hands, and even the most exalted sailor offered a nod or a quiet word. They were alive. That alone was enough to be grateful. By the third day, the ship began to look whole again. The mainsail was patched, the rudder reset, and the decks swept clean. Okay? The scars of the storm remained, but they wore them with pride. How helped re-braid the anchor ropes, his fingers blistered and sore. I'm not the same crew, he thought. We are not the men who feared the storm. We are the ones who survived it. Li Wei called for a brief ceremony on the 4th evening. No drums, no songs, just silence and a bowl of water placed at the bow. "This water is not for washing," he said. "It is for remembering." Each sailor dipped his hand in, then touched the wood of the ship. It was a simple gesture, but it sealed something sacred. An unspoken vow between man and vessel, forged by wind and wave. That night, as the stars returned, the crew sat together on the deck. Not to plan or work, but simply to be. The sea was quiet, like a sleeping beast. And above them, constellations moved with ancient rhythm. See How traced them with his eyes, naming each one now without doubt. He had learned not just to sail but to listen to the sky in his journal. Hai carved a new word beneath the others. Rebirth. The sea had broken them, and in doing so, remade them. He no longer felt like a passenger. He was the voyage itself, rising, falling, surviving, and beginning again. Asterisk, weeks passed in steady silence. The ship glided southward through golden light and soft breezes. But something changed in the air, a new scent, faint and dry, like burned wood in distant soil. The sky took on a reddish hue, and the sea grew deeper in color, almost violet. Li Wei gathered the senior crew one evening and unrolled a map unlike any other. "We are here," he said, pointing to a blank edge. "No scroll marks this region. We sail into myth." The younger sailors grew silent, unsure whether to feel fear or excitement. See How felt both. The thought of venturing beyond all known boundaries made his heart race. He walked the deck that night in long circles, touching the rail, watching the water. He had dreamed of adventure, but now they were crossing into something else. It was no longer a journey of distance. It was a journey beyond knowledge. The wind shifted again. It grew unpredictable, gentle at dawn, violent by noon, gone by night. Birds no longer followed them. Even fish were scarce. The sea here moved differently, like a creature thinking, pausing, watching. Some sailors murmured prayers. Others worked harder, focused on motion, not meaning. But all of them felt it. They were being observed. On the fifth day, in the blank sea, they saw lights on the horizon, pale green flickers like stars resting on the water. Leeway ordered silence. The crew watched without blinking as the lights danced and faded, never approaching. Some believed they were spirits. Others said it was volcanic gas. No one knew. But when they vanished, a hush fell over the deck, like snowfall. No one dared speak until morning. Seahow wrote nothing that night. He only sat on the steps of the quarterdeck, eyes wide, heart open. He felt like a guest in someone else's world, walking gently, asking for nothing. And that humility gave him peace. He didn't need to understand. He only needed to witness. Leeway marked their course carefully, noting every cloud, current, and pressure change. We are beyond charts now, he told Seahow quietly, but not beyond guidance. He pointed to the stars. The sky still knows where we are, even if the scrolls do not. And with that, they sailed forward, guided by light, memory, and trust. Each mile ahead was a step into story. And every breath the crew took became part of something older than language. They were no longer explorers. They were whispers in wind drifting across the edge of the world. Asterisk, the days grew warmer, but the sky dimmed, always filtered through a mist that never quite lifted. The sea here shimmered strangely, not reflecting the sky, but bending it. Shapes beneath the surface moved slowly, as if in sleep. The sailors began to dream more vividly of places they'd never seen, people they'd never met, languages they didn't know. When they awoke, their hearts were heavy, as if they'd lost something precious they couldn't name. Seahow dreamed of walking across a sea made of glass, his feet echoing like bells. In his hand, he held a scroll that unraveled endlessly, filled with writing he couldn't read, but somehow understood. When he awoke, his pillow was damp with tears. He couldn't explain why, but he felt as though something ancient had spoken through him. Not to him, but through him. Others began reporting the same. Leeway listened quietly, never dismissing the accounts. "This is the dreaming sea," he finally said. "In the old stories, it's where the world remembers itself. Every wave is a memory, every breeze a sigh." He ordered fewer tasks and more silence. We sail now, not with strength, but with stillness. One afternoon, the crew heard voices, not shouts, not song, but gentle hums, like women singing lullabies across the waves. No source could be seen, but the sound came and went like breath. It wasn't frightening, it was mournful, like a mother calling a lost child. Many sailors wept quietly, without knowing why. Seahow sat by the bow with his journal, but didn't write. He just listened. He thought of his mother, of his village, of all the names he'd forgotten. The sea carried them for him. That night, he dreamed again, not of places, but of feelings, belonging, longing, remembering, becoming. Leeway spoke little during those days. He spent long hours standing at the stern, eyes half closed, as if listening to something no one else could hear. It was guiding them not by compass, but by memory, both his own and the sea's, and the crew followed without question. They had learned that trust in silence was stronger than fear of the unknown. When the mist finally lifted, the sea sparkled again, but differently. It was not the same ocean they had entered. It was deeper now, not in depth, but in meaning, and every man aboard understood it in his own way. The journey had crossed into something sacred, something beyond discovery, something eternal. The water grew still again, almost sacred in its calm. On the horizon, the sky touched the sea in a seamless line of wind. No waves, only a golden mirror stretching in all directions. Leeway announced they would stop for a day. No movement, just stillness. We have reached the middle, he said. Not of the journey, of ourselves. The crew spent the day in meditation. No repairs, no cooking, no orders, just breath, just presence. Some sat in silence, others lay with eyes open, watching clouds drift. See how walked to the center of the deck and lay flat on the warm planks. He imagined himself dissolving into the ship, becoming one with the wood, the salt, the story. And for a moment, he felt weightless. At sunset, the sky turned fire red, and the sea glowed with its reflection. The entire world seemed to burn, but without heat, without fear. The Caravel floated in that fiery stillness like a thought suspended between waking and sleep. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Everything that mattered had already been said by the ocean itself. See how closed his eyes and let his mind drift. He saw the mirrored island, the fire moon, the deep storm, the Southern Cross. He saw his younger self waving goodbye at the dock, and he saw his future self, older, seated by a fire, telling the story to children who watched with wide eyes. He smiled. The voyage was not just happening, it was becoming legend. That night, the crew gathered and shared simple tea boiled in silence. Lee Wei lifted his cup and said, "Only remember this stillness. You'll seek it again one day." And they drank, not as sailors, but as souls, passing through a moment the world would never repeat. Stars emerged, brighter than ever before. The sea held them like jewels. And the ship, battered and blessed, floated between heaven and earth. A vessel not only of men, but of memory, myth, and meaning. They slept deeply that night. No dreams, no fears. Just peace. Asterisk, after a week of silence and perfect skies, land emerged once more yet. No one cheered. It was as if the crew had grown reverent of new horizons, approaching each one as a shrine rather than a conquest. The island was flat and ringed with white sand, its center covered in dark trees so dense they blocked out the sun. Birds circled high but never landed. No smoke rose. No sound came from its depths. It simply ... waited. Lee Wei lowered the anchor but forbade immediate landing. "Observe first," he said. "Let the island speak before we enter." For a full day, the crew watched from the deck. Nothing moved, not the trees, not the waters around it. It was a still painting, untouched. That night, Zi Hao dreamed of eyes watching from behind bark. When he awoke, he felt come strangely invited. The next morning, a small party rowed ashore. The moment they stepped onto the sand, the temperature shifted. The air was cooler, as if the island lived in its own climate. The sand was not hot, but soft and cool beneath their feet. They moved quietly into the forest, following a narrow path that seemed too perfect to be natural. It curved in spirals, always forward, never back. Inside the forest, the light changed. The leaves shimmered silver when the sun touched them. Air smelled of jasmine and old stone. Zi Hao saw carvings on tree spirals, stars, hands. No words, only symbols that felt deeply familiar, though no one could say why. There was no fear, just presence, as if they were not walking into something foreign, but something remembered. In the very heart of the island stood a single stone arch covered in moss, framing nothing but more forest. Li Wei stopped the group and bowed deeply. "As far as we go," he said. Beyond this, it is not for our bodies to pass. They left offerings small jade rings, dried lotus, and rice sand turned back. The forest accepted them silently. The trees moved slightly with windless grace. Back aboard the ship, no one spoke of treasure or conquest, only of beauty, of balance. See how sat for hours, carving the archway into his scroll. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it belonged. Among the others, beside the mountain, the cross, the spiral. These were no longer decorations. They were pieces of a larger story unfolding not around him, but within him. That evening, the ship set sail again. No songs were sung, just a quiet wind, a calm sea, and the echo of an island with no name. An island that felt less like a place and more like a memory the world had left behind for those who still listened. Asterisk, 3 days into open sea. The crew noticed something strange. The compass no longer moved, no matter how they turned. The needle stayed fixed, pointing forward with stubborn stillness. Li Wei tested 3 different compasses, each from a different province. All gave the same result. We are beyond magnetism, he said, or within something greater than it. The crew stared at the needle, wondering if the sea had decided their direction. Navigation shifted to sky alone. Every night, Li Wei stood with his star charts, mapping their path by constellations alone. And strangely, the stars themselves seemed clearer, sharper, closer. See how began to memorize them by name, by color, by pulse. He felt them speaking in silence, like the sea had before. Their direction now was no longer chosen, it was received. The wind remained constant, neither strong nor soft. The ocean flattened slightly, making their passage eerily smooth. Fish swam beside them, unafraid, and the sails barely needed trimming. Some of the crew whispered they had passed into another realm, one ruled by memory and soul, not tide and wind. No one dismissed. It felt too real. One evening, the crew watched the sunset in perfect silence. As the sky turned crimson, Zi Hao turned to Li Wei and asked, "How do we know we're going the right way?" "Okay?" The commander did not answer right away. Then, softly, he said, "Because we're still being guided. Even when the tools stop working, the heart keeps knowing." He touched his chest. "This is the new compass." That night, Zi Hao dreamt of a needle floating in water, but instead of metal, it was made of light. It spun gently, then aligned with a voice he couldn't hear, only feel. When he awoke, he carved a simple circle into his scroll with a single arrow inside. He didn't label it. He didn't need to. It was the mark of faith in motion without certainty. For the next few days, the compass remained still. But no one questioned it. They followed the stars, the sky, the silence, and the sea carried them onward as if it too had surrendered control. It was no longer a journey powered by man, but by intentional surrender into something beyond maps and tides. And when finally, on the 6th morning, the compass needle shifted again just slightly, the crew exhaled in unison. Not in relief, but in reverence. They hadn't been lost. They had simply been trusted. Asterisk, it began as a vibration barely felt, not heard. Hao first noticed it while standing barefoot on the deck, adjusting sail ropes. The wood beneath his feet pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat. He paused, pressed his palm to the plank, and waited. There it was again, a thrum, deep and steady, rising from below. He ran to Li Wei, who listened and nodded. "The sea is singing again," he said, "but this time it is beneath us." Soon, others felt it too. The whole hull seemed to resonate, like a great instrument. No one could pinpoint a source. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't structural. It was ... alive. At night, if one pressed their ear to the wood, they could hear tones long, low notes, vibrating like distant horns, calling across valleys of time. It was beautiful and unsettling. The crew changed. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Everyone listened more. Fewer orders were needed. People acted from instinct. The ship had become a choir, each member a note in a larger harmony. See How began humming, without realizing the melody not his own, but carried by the rhythm of the floor beneath him. He felt no fear-only purpose. Li Wei brought out a silk scroll he had not touched in years. It contained poems from ancient navigators' men who claimed to hear the ocean below the ocean. Qi read a line aloud. When the sea begins to hum, the earth beneath it remembers. The crew listened in silence. The words did not explain. They confirmed. On the fourth night, the song changed. It grew higher, faster, until it reached a moment of stillness and then vanished entirely. The next morning, the sea was utterly calm. Not a wave, not a breeze, just reflection. The ship stood still, not by anchor, by choice. We have been shown something, Li Wei whispered. Oh, we must hold it. That day, no one worked. They simply sat, wrote, sang, slept, prayed. See How dipped a brush in ink and drew the hull of the ship as if it were a harp, strings stretching down into the sea. He did not understand the image fully, but his hands moved with certainty. Sea had sung through them. That was enough, and by nightfall, when the wind returned and the ship moved again, it did so gently, as if grateful, and everyone aboard knew that something deep beneath them had spoken, and they had listened. On the 24th morning, the ship crossed into waters of a strange color, deep blue, with veins of green that pulsed faintly like fire beneath ice. The air turned sharp, even under the sun, and when the sailors dipped their hands into the sea, they gasped. The water was freezing, but it didn't sting, tingled, as if charged with something unseen. This is sacred water, Li Wei murmured. It burns with memory. That night, the crew discovered something extraordinary. Every bucket of water brought aboard shimmered faintly in the dark. It glowed softly, like the breath of stars trapped inside. The men didn't dare use it for cleaning. Instead, they sat beside the buckets, watching the glow, whispering stories of the constellations above. See How felt as though he were standing between two skies, one above, one below, both listening. Li Wei allowed one ritual to be performed. Each man dipped his 2 fingers into the glowing water and touched his forehead. It wasn't religious. It wasn't ceremonial. It was ... grateful. They didn't ask what it meant. They didn't need to. In these waters, meaning had shifted from thought to experience, and each moment was its own explanation. By the 3rd day, in those glowing seas, the crew's dreams intensified again. Some spoke of speaking to we ancestors. Others saw temples under the sea, golden domes where voices sang in languages without sound. See How dreamed of a mirror made of water, where his reflection aged and then smiled at him. He awoke with tears, not of sadness, but of recognition. The fish changed too. Schools of pale, translucent creatures swam beside the ship, undisturbed by its shadow. They moved like dancers, choreographed by some silent music that only they could hear. Even the birds that passed overhead flew lower, circling the mast without sound. It felt as though the world had entered a gentler heartbeat, and all life breathed in sync. When the ship finally passed out of that current, the water returned to normal. The glow faded, the chill lifted, but the crew had been marked. Even without proof, every man aboard felt different, more awake, more aware. Zi Hao held one drop of the sacred water in a small vial, wrapped in silk, not to keep, just to remember, and as the warm breeze returned and the sails filled, they sailed forward, not in search, but in thanks. They had been given a glimpse of something most would never know. Not power, not treasure, but presence. Asterisk. It came at dawn, a silhouette on the water, like a mirage. Towers, sails, flags. As the sun rose, it became clear. A floating city, built from dozens of ships lashed together, forming a labyrinth of decks, bridges, and cloth canopies. The crew stared in awe. No one had ever spoken of such a place. It moves with the wind, Leeway whispered. A city that sails with the horizon. They approached. Drums began to echo from the structure. Figures in bright robes waved banners and signaled for peace. Leeway returned the gesture. The two vessels connected with thick ropes, and a bridge of planks was drawn between them. See, Hal was among the first to cross. He felt as if he were stepping not into another ship, but another world. The people of the floating city spoke many tongues, wore silken feathers, and carried trinkets from lands the crew had never seen. Some had tattoos of sea serpents on their backs. Others wore necklaces made from pearl and glass. The air was filled with music, soft strings and bells that played without hands, as if the city itself was alive. It felt like a dream built from wind and wood. Trade began quickly. The floating people offered dried fruits, strange maps, instruments, and powder that made water taste sweet. In return, the Chinese crew gave porcelain cups, medicinal herbs, and scrolls of poetry. The real exchange was not of goods. It was of wonder, of curiosity, mutual recognition between wanderers. See how wandered the floating alleys, touching carvings on driftwood, reading scripts etched into sails. He sat with an old woman who painted his palm with blue ink, saying, "You've seen something holy. It will never wash off, even if the sea takes your body." He didn't ask what she meant. He simply nodded and smiled. At sunset, a ceremony was held. Lanterns floated between the ships, carrying messages in hundreds of languages. Leeway lit one himself, placing a folded map inside. "Let our paths meet again," he said quietly. See how released his own, watching it drift into the orange sky like a glowing leaf. It carried no words, only breath. The next morning, the ships parted. No flag was raised, no farewell shouted, only silence and long gazes across water. The floating city faded into mist, and the Caravel moved on, as if returning from a place outside of time. But in their hearts, the city would sail forever. Asterisk. The days following the encounter with the floating city were marked by stillness. The sails hung limp, the sea a flat sheet of metal. Leeway stood at the helm, unmoving, his hand resting lightly on the wheel. "Now we wait," he said. "The wind has given much. It needs time to breathe." And so the crew waited, without worry, without movement. The ship became a floating monastery. Food was measured precisely. Water was poured carefully. Every act became intentional. The crew fell into meditation. No one complained. Some sat for hours, doing nothing but listening. See how found himself breathing with the ship, feeling its slow creaks, its groans, its pulse. Even without wind, it was alive. Stillness was not absence, it was preparation. One night, a soft gust passed through the rigging so light it barely moved the sails, but every man felt it. Eyes opened, heads turned. It's returning. Someone whispered, but Leeway shook his head. Not yet. That was the memory of wind, not its body. The next day passed in silence once more, and another, until finally, in the sixth evening, the sails stirred like waking wings. The wind returned not as a rush but as a breath, soft, steady, warm. The ship groaned in thanks, and the crew moved as one, raising sail, tying knots, adjusting course. The Caravel leaned forward like a tiger stretching its spine. They were moving again, not fast, but with purpose. The ocean parted before them in ripples that shimmered like silk. See how stood at the bow and closed his eyes. The wind touched his face gently, then moved on, like a teacher acknowledging a student. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply inhaled and exhaled. He was part of the wind now. Not its master, not its passenger. Its echo. Li Wei gave. Only one instruction. Follow it. No stars, no compasses, no charts. Only the wind. For days, they let it choose. Indeed, it did not erratically, but gracefully, as if it had waited for them to become ready, as if it had something to show them, something that could not be found on maps. And so they sailed, trusting the invisible, carried not by ambition, but by alignment. In the sea, always listening, led them toward something more. Asterisk, it appeared without warning, shimmering on the horizon, like a mirage. At first, the crew thought it was a cloud formation or a trick of light, but as they neared, the shape sharpened into mountains, peaks so pale they mirrored the sky above. The island was massive, surrounded by still water that reflected its image perfectly, creating the illusion of floating. Li Wei narrowed his eyes and whispered, "A sky island, seen from the sea." As the ship drew closer, silence fell. The crew spoke in gestures, moving slowly, reverently. The island seemed untouched, unclaimed. No signs of harbor, no canoes, no smoke. Only peaks, valleys, and a soft mist that rolled along its cliffs like breathing. See how felt his pulse slow, as if his heart knew it was nearing something sacred. The sea itself calmed, as if asking permission to approach. Li Wei ordered anchor near a crystal-clear lagoon. The water was so pure it revealed the sand and coral beneath, colored like ancient paintings. A small group rowed ashore, their voices low, their steps respectful. As they set foot on the land, birds flew overhead in slow, circular patterns as if blessing the landing. The beach was cool, the wind gentle, and everything shimmered with a strange inner light. They explored a short distance inland, finding strange flowers that closed when touched, stones that resonated when struck, and trees whose bark bore markings like calligraphy. There were no ruins, no people, but the island felt full of presence, of memory, of stories carved into air. See how stopped beneath a tree and felt as though he were being read, not by eyes, but by time itself. Li Wei found a quiet cove and placed 3 stones in a line on the sand. A path, a pause, a passage, he said softly. Each sailor added a stone until a small mound stood, a marker of arrival without conquest. They left no flags, no names, just breath, footsteps, and intention. The island accepted them in silence, and when they returned to the ship, the sea stirred again as if sighing approval. That night, no one slept. They sat on deck, watching the island reflect the stars. It looked like a heaven built from earth, or a memory rising from the water. See how wept without sadness. The island hadn't shown him anything. It had simply reminded him of everything he already carried in his journal. He drew only 2 lines, a triangle above, a triangle below. He labeled neither, and as the ship sailed gently away at sunrise, the island vanished into the clouds, its form returning to sky, its story resting in the hearts of those who had seen it. 4 days after leaving the island, the sea remained peaceful. But Li Wei knew the pattern. Every deep calm invites a deeper storm, he warned. The wind began to pulse irregularly, and clouds formed not in clusters, but in spirals. Birds flew low again. Fish disappeared. The crew prepared with quiet precision. They were no longer afraid of storms, but they respected them deeply. By the 3rd day, the sky had turned to iron. Rain began not with drops, but with sheets, as if the heavens had unzipped. The sails were pulled in, hatches sealed. The ship groaned as the first waves struck tall, hard, with no rhythm. See how tied himself to a beam and held firm, blinking through the downpour. Thunder cracked, not above but within the sea itself, as if the ocean had found its own voice. This storm was unlike the last. It didn't roar, it screamed. The wind cut sideways, ripping cloth, loosening ropes, tearing lids from barrels. The ship rose and fell like a dying bird trying to fly. But the crew, hardened by memory and bound by unity, moved as one. No panic, only presence. They were no longer passengers in a storm. They were participants. Li Wei stood at the helm, soaked to the bone, eyes calm. He didn't fight the storm. He read it, felt its weight, its tempo, its breathing. He adjusted the rudder, not by logic, but by instinct. See how watched him, learning not just with his eyes, but with his bones. This was no longer seamanship. It was communion. For hours, they endured. The world reduced to wind, water, and will. One mast cracked but did not fall. One sailor was swept halfway overboard but caught by 3 hands. They did not shout. They did not celebrate. They simply moved because movement meant survival and trust meant everything. Then, just as suddenly, the sea exhaled. The rain thinned, the wind softened, and the ship floated battered, bruised, but whole. The crew dropped to their knees, not in exhaustion, but in thanks. Li Wei raised his hand and said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence of survival spoke louder than any speech. See how walked the length of the deck that night, barefoot, soaking in the scent of rain and salt. He whispered a single word to the sky. We're still here, okay? And for the first time, he didn't feel small beneath the stars. He felt part of them. The storm had passed, but the crew had changed again. Their faces older, their hands tougher, their silence deeper. They spoke less, listened more, and the sea responded. For the first time in weeks, it began to show signs of familiar tides currents that curved like remembered roots. We're near something old, Li Wei said, not in distance in story. They crossed into a bay surrounded by dark cliffs. The water here shimmered oddly with colors that pulsed beneath the surface green, violet, gold. See how leaned over the edge and saw shadows moving like schools of memories, not fish. Hesh, when he blinked, they were gone. But the feeling remained. Something beneath them was watching, not with eyes, but with remembrance. At the base of the cliffs, they found carvings, not recent, not weathered, ancient. They depicted ships, stars, spirals, and hands. The crew stared, in silence. These symbols matched their own scrolls, their own dreams. We are not the first, Li Wei said, and we will not be the last. It wasn't unsettling, it was beautiful. That night, the water glowed faintly under the moonlight, and a mist rose not thick, but silver. The ship drifted without sails, carried by a current no one commanded. Music was heard again, soft and distant. No instruments, just the hum of the sea itself, rising like incense. The crew sat together, not speaking, not needing to. Their hearts moved in rhythm with the water. See how sat at the stern and finally opened his scroll. He traced every symbol, every line. He added one more, a single spiral wrapped around a small boat. He closed his eyes and saw his entire journey, not as events, but as a thread, one that wove through stars, through storms, through islands, and silenced that Li Wei knelt by the bow and poured a ladle of water back into the sea. Take our memory, he said, carry it forward, Kay, and the sea, ever listening, shimmered in reply. They slept deeply that night, and the sea, in its wisdom, cradled them as gently as a mother holding the last breath of a dream. The sky broke in gold on the 30th morning. No clouds, no wind, it's just light, pure and endless. On the horizon, a thin line of land appeared, familiar, yet distant, like a childhood song, hummed years later. Li Wei stood quietly at the helm. "We're returning," he said. But no one cheered, as they all knew they would never truly return. As the land grew closer, the shape of mountains and trees revealed themselves. See how recognized? None of its hand, all of it. It wasn't the same shore they had left. It wasn't meant to be. They had changed, and so had the world. The dock awaited, but so did something else, a different rhythm in their steps, a deeper stillness in their gaze. The ship docked silently. No drums, no horns, only breath and wood and rope. One by one, they stepped onto the land, not as the men who had left, but as the stories the sea had written. See how paused at the bottom of the gangplank. He touched the ship's hull and whispered, "Thank you." The wood was warm, but replied with silence. Li Wei turned once to look at the ocean. Then he nodded and walked ahead. The crew dispersed and not lost, not broken, transformed. Each carried something unseen in their chest: salt, song, stillness, and the sound of stars. They would return to villages, to families, to lives, but they would never truly return to who they had been. That evening, See How sat by the water and unrolled his scroll one last time. Every mark, every line was there, a silent history of wind, of wonder, of witnessing. He didn't add anything. He didn't need to. He simply rolled it, tied it, and placed it in a small wooden box, not to forget, but to keep remembering slowly. And as the sun set behind the hills, casting gold across the waves, the boy who had left as a dreamer stood as something else, a sailor, a witness, a vessel of stories. He closed his eyes and let the final breath of sea wind brush his face. The voyage was over, but the sea still sang inside him. Asterisk, they reached it at twilight, a small village carved into the base of coastal cliffs, where the wind whispered through trees bent by age and salt. Smoke rose gently from clay chimneys, and the scent of roasted roots and seaweed drifted across the sand. Children played barefoot on the shore, chasing shadows as if they were butterflies, and the elders watched with eyes full of silence. It wasn't marked on any map. It wasn't built to be found. Yet the sea had brought them there intentionally. Gently, that the villagers welcomed the crew, not with words, but with warm food and slow smiles. They did not ask where the sailors had come from, nor did they question what they sought. They seemed to already know, perhaps not the details, but the weight behind their eyes, the way their hands moved with reverence instead of urgency. These were people who understood the rhythm of tide and time. They had no need for introductions. The sea had already spoken for them. See How followed an old woman through winding paths between stone huts, past hanging lanterns made from glass and bone. She led him to a small structure at the edge of the cliff, where the floor was covered in sea-smooth stones and the ceiling open to the stars. "Sit," she said, and he did, for hours, in silence. The only sound was the surf below and the occasional breath of wind. No lesson was given. Yet something vast was learned. Elsewhere in the village, other sailors were guided to similar places, some to gardens that only bloomed at night, others to rooms filled with ancient maps, drawn not on paper, but etched into walls. They were not taught. They were remembered. Each man found something waiting for him that seemed impossibly personal an object, a word, a gaze that pierced deeper than reason. It was as though the village had prepared for their arrival before they were ever born. Li Wei sat with the village chief under a great tree, whose trunk was hollow and sang when the wind moved through it. They said little, but as the fire crackled between them, the chief handed him a stone compass with no needle. "Because now you carry the direction inside you," the chief said. Li Wei bowed, not as a leader, but as a student. That night, feast was held not of noise or drunkenness, but of laughter and memory. The villagers shared songs sung in unison, voices weaving in and out like tide over sand. The crew joined in, even if they didn't know the words. Didn't matter. The melody accepted them anyway. See how stood by the fire, the light reflecting off his eyes, and felt, for the first time since leaving Canton, that maybe he had arrived, not at a destination, but at a beginning. When they departed the next morning, the villagers did not wave. They simply stood still, hands folded, eyes watching as the ship pulled away. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a promise that the sea always remembers, that those who listen never truly leave. And as the cliffs faded into mist, the Caravel carried not just cargo, not just crew, but the silent blessing of a village beyond the edge of the map. As the Caravel sailed further, the world began to change, again not through landscape, but through perception. Colors deepened, sounds stretched, time slowed. The crew spoke less, not out of exhaustion, but because language itself began to feel insufficient. Words couldn't capture the weight of what they felt anymore. How do you describe a wind that carries memory? A star that knows your name? They began to communicate differently through glances, through gestures, through shared silence. Li Wei noticed it first. Commands no longer needed to be shouted. A nod was enough. A hand on the shoulder carried more instruction than a full sentence. Even disagreements dissolved before they began, resolved with a look, a breath, a memory. The ship became a single mind, thinking through dozens of hearts. It was not magic, it was alignment. The sea had taught them that language is not always spoken, it is lived. See how began dreaming again. But this time the dreams were not visions, they were sensations. Warmth, light, movement. Sometimes he would wake with tears and not know why. Other times he would smile for hours with no explanation. One afternoon, while adjusting a sail, he looked at the sky and suddenly understood a truth that he couldn't explain to anyone because it had no shape. It was something to be carried, not told. The crew began carving symbols into the wood of the ship's circles, spirals, lines that curved like waves and stars. No one assigned meanings, yet everyone understood. Spiral on the mast meant hold fast. A circle near the stairs meant wait here. Pair of vertical lines on the bow meant we've been here before. The ship slowly became a language of its own. The vessel had become both tool and teacher. One evening, the sea turned mirror smooth again, and the crew sat on deck, watching clouds reflect below them. Li Wei took out a blank scroll, dipped his brush, and began painting not words, but a line that never ended. It twisted, curved, doubled back, and kept going. When he finished, he handed it to Zihao. "This is how far we've come," he said, "and it has no translation." They sailed for 5 more days without needing to speak. They sang, yes, soft harmonies that rose with the wind, but conversation, as they had known it had changed. They now lived a language beyond sound. The sea understood them, and perhaps, finally, they understood it in return. When a gull cried on the 6th morning, it startled them not because it was loud, but because it was ordinary. And in that moment, they knew they were nearing land again, and with it, the return of the world. But they would carry this language forever. The one that was carved into silence and stars. Asterisk, it was late afternoon when the lookout cried, land. A shape appeared on the horizon, familiar, earthy, known. The hills rolled gently. The rivers flowed like remembered poems. Zihao stood at the rail, hands trembling. Hands circled the world. They had returned, but nothing was the same. Not the land, not the sea, not themselves. Li Wei gathered the crew on deck. He looked at each man, not as a captain inspecting his sailors, but as a father seeing his sons come home with deeper eyes. "You will step onto shore," he said softly. "But remember, your voyage is not behind you. It lives in you. Walk gently, speak carefully, carry the sea with reverence, for she trusted you." The harbor was quiet as they approached. A few fishermen turned to look, unaware of what kind of ship approached them. To them, it was a large Chinese vessel, weathered, majestic, nothing more. But to those aboard, the ship was not wood and sail. It was memory, miracle, and meaning. It had been their world, their church, their teacher. As the anchor dropped, no drums played, no banners waved, only footsteps, one by one, pressing into the dock. See how stepped last, holding the scroll in his hands. The city beyond looked smaller. Then he remembered. Streets too narrow, walls too low. Yet, in their quiet, he felt something sacred. The ordinary had become extraordinary, simply because of who he now was. The crew began to disperse slowly. Some to families, others to temples, some to solitude. Li Wei remained on deck until the last man departed, then walked alone into the crowd. No words were exchanged, no speeches given. The sea did not like ceremony, slight remembering. See how walked through the market square, past stalls and lanterns and voices. But he heard none of it. What he heard were the waves, the songs, silence of stars. In the middle of the crowd, he paused, closed his eyes, and smiled, 'cause he realized something. He was not back. He was forward, always forward, and as the sky turned violet above the rooftops, and the wind tugged at his sleeve like a whisper, he opened his scroll and let it roll open once more, this time not to record, but to breathe. Asterisk back in the city. The noise felt strange, after months of listening to the language of waves, stars, and wind. The marketplace's chatter was like a foreign dialect, familiar, but hollow. Hao walked through the stone streets with his bundle of scrolls pressed to his chest. People smiled, children ran, incense burned from temples, but it was all distant, as though he moved through a memory that had not fully returned. He returned to his childhood home, where his mother's garden still bloomed, and the same wind chimes hung on the porch. Yet when they rang, he heard not the tones of bells, but the echo of sea storms and sails flapping in salt air. His mother wept when she saw him, but he could only hold her, unable to find words that matched the tide inside his heart. He explained that he had left as a boy, but returned as part of the ocean itself. At night, he lay on his mat and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows shift like waves. His dreams were filled with sails again, with voices calling from under the sea, and a gentle creak of wood in rhythm with stars. He awoke with tears and smiles and silence. He no longer needed to tell stories with words. The voyage had made him the story. In the days that followed, people asked questions. Where did you go? What did you see? What did you bring back? See how would smile softly and reply only distance. Because what he had brought back was not gold or spices, but distance between who he was and who he had become. And in that space, there was transformation too wide for words. He found himself drawn to the harbor, watching the ships come and go, their sails full of purpose, their decks filled with men who had not yet faced the fire of the deep. He felt neither superiority nor nostalgia nor gratitude, for he knew the journey wasn't meant for everyone. Some were born to sail, others were born to remember the sea inside them forever. Each evening, he returned to the cliffs outside the city, where the ocean was still visible on the horizon. He brought no compass, no maps, only silence. And there, as the sky bled into dusk and the sea swallowed the sun, he sat in stillness, feeling the tide within his chest, identically. Like blood, but like wind, was no longer waiting for something. He had already become it, and so The city accepted him not as the boy who had left, but as something else, a tidewalker, a star breather, a man shaped by silence, storms, and memory. He spoke little, but those who met his eyes knew he had been somewhere no feet could walk, only hearts could carry. Asterisk on the third week after returning. See how unrolled his long scroll on a table beside the temple pond. It stretched further than he remembered, so far that it spilled over the table, onto the ground, curling like a wave. The drawings were raw and beautiful. Spirals, stars, masts, fish, constellations, islands, storms, and a single boat drawn, over and over again in different forms. It was not a map. It was a soul unfurled. A monk passed by and asked gently, "What story does it tell?" See how looked down and replied, "All of them," because within that scroll lived not just his memories, but echoes of every sailor, every storm, every silence he had sailed through. It wasn't a record of events. It was a vessel of emotion, movement, surrender. The scroll was not something he had made, something he had become. Each day, he added a new mark not to document, but to continue. A curve, a symbol, a line that curled into itself and re-emerged. The scroll grew not in length, but in depth. People began to visit him, not to hear tales, but to sit quietly and observe the scroll. Some wept, others meditated. A coup brought their own brushes and added silent symbols of gratitude, as if contributing to a shared language of return. Eventually, the temple offered him a room small, quiet, filled with sea breeze and light. There, the scroll remained open always. It became known as the sea's memory, and though no one claimed to fully understand it, everyone agreed, standing in its presence changed something inside. Not through logic, but through recognition, reminded them of what they had forgotten. They were born with. Children would touch the edges and ask, "Is it finished?" See how it smile and say, "Nothing is finished that breathes." And the scroll breathed. You could feel it in the quiet between sounds, in the ripple of air. When the doors opened, it held no beginning and no end-only movement. One morning, as he drew a single spiral within a wave, Hal realized that even if the scroll were burned or lost, it would not matter, because the real story had already been carved into the deck. See, the stars, the silence and into his very being. The scroll was never the destination. It was the echo of a voyage still unfolding, and as he put down the brush, he whispered, not to the paper, but to the wind beyond the window, "Thank you for letting me return, okay?" And the wind replied with a rustle, as if opening a new page. Years passed, the scroll grew, the temple garden changed with the seasons. And Hal became an old man, not weakened, but softened, like driftwood shaped by years of current. He walked slowly now, but his gaze held the same fire it did when he first saw the Southern Cross. Children called him Master of the Sea without maps. He never corrected them. He simply smiled. He rarely spoke of the voyage anymore. Not because he had forgotten, but because it no longer lived in the past. It lived in the way he stirred tea, the way he watched the wind, the way he paused before answering. The sea had not left him, it had simply shifted from horizon to heart. Then, one quiet morning, the wind changed. It came not from the mountains, but from the ocean. It slipped through the trees, down the alleys, and across the temple stones. It carried salt. It carried song. See how opened his eyes and smiled. "It's time," he whispered, and without ceremony, he walked out of the temple and down to the harbor there. An old boat awaited, small, unmarked, perfect. The villagers watched as he stepped aboard. No one stopped him. No one asked questions. They had learned some things are not meant to be explained, only honored. He raised no sail. The wind carried him out, slowly, gently, into the gold of morning. Out at sea, the boat drifted toward the horizon. The scroll was left behind, but no one mourned, for they knew, carried a new scroll now, one made of cloud, current, and memory, one that could never be unrolled, but could be felt with every heartbeat beneath the stars. And when the sun finally dipped and the sea swallowed the boat in light, a single gull cried overhead. The harbor stood still. No sadness, no loss, only awe, because the tide had returned, and it carried one of its own home. Asterisk, some say that on certain nights, when the sea is calm and the stars hold still, a strange formation appears in the sky, a new constellation shaped, not like an animal or a hunter, but like a boat. Its outline is faint, barely visible, but unmistakable to those who have truly sailed. It has no sails, no oars, it's just a curve, like a crescent cradling silence. Those who see it feel something stir deep within them, man, ache, not of loss, but of longing. The monks at the temple say that the stars rearranged themselves, the night sea how sailed into the light, that heaven received him, not as a soul, but as a tide, that he did not vanish, he ascended sideways into the fabric of wind and current. And now, whenever someone feels a breeze touch their cheek in perfect stillness, they say, he passed by. Children visiting the scroll room ask why the last page of the great scroll is blank. The elders smile and say, because some stories finish after we stop writing. And yet, if one leans close enough, under soft light with the scent of salt in the air, they might see a faint mark of spiral within a spiral. No ink, just memory pressed into paper. Sailors still visit the harbor to leave offerings at the last dock where Z had departed. Not incense or coin but symbols, a carved shell, a knot of rope, a smooth stone. They leave not in worship, but in kinship, because they too have heard the sea whisper. They too carry stories no one else will ever truly understand. Hand in those quiet offerings, they speak the same silent language he once taught. Sometimes, on windless nights, the sea glows, faintly with no moon. A pulse, like breath, spreads across the water. The tide rolls in slower. The gulls fall silent. And the old fisherman nod. He is near. For those who listen, truly listen, the sea will always speak, not in words, okay, but in waves, and in that starry silence, under the arc of the boat constellation. A boy might one day raise his eyes and ask his father, what's out there? And the father, without answering, will simply smile and place his hand on the boy's chest. You already carry it. Because the journey never ends. It only changes shape. Asterisk, in another part of the world, by a river instead of an ocean. A girl sits under a tree, tracing shapes in the dirt. She's never seen the sea, but she dreams of water that stretches forever, of winds that speak, of ships that breathe. No one told her these stories, yet she knows them deeply, as if her blood remembers what her ears never heard. She draws spirals, stars, and boats with broken masts. Her village calls her strange. She talks little, but listens well. As animals gather near her, as wines shift when she walks. Rain begins when she sings softly. The elders whisper that she has ocean soul, a name passed down once in a generation. She doesn't understand what it means yet, but every night she stares at the sky and searches for a curve made of stars. One day, while gathering herbs, she finds a washed-up bottle in the reeds. Inside, a scroll thing, faded but intact. When she unrolls it, her hands tremble. There are symbols she's drawn since she was a child. Spirals, waves, boats, mountains, eyes. At the end of the scroll, one line of words. You are already listening. Follow. She doesn't know how, but her feet begin to move. She walks away from her village, toward a coast she's never seen. guided by something deeper than direction. The trees part, the birds lead. And days later, she arrives at the temple by the harbor where monks greet her, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if they had been waiting, as if they always knew the sea would send someone new. They show her the great scroll room. She kneels before the final page, blank but breathing, K. And when handed a brush, she does not hesitate. She draws a single boat. No sails, no crew, just a curved cradle floating between stars. She does not speak. She does not explain. K. The page accepts her offering like the tide accepts moonlight. And in that moment, something ancient is confirmed. That the story did not end with Zihao. That the sea does not remember us once but again and again. That the ones who listen are always connected, across generations, across silence, across distance. The girl rises, and the tide within her begins. For journeys are not passed down by telling, they are inherited through presence. Asterisk, years later. A group of travelers cross an unfamiliar ocean, guided only by stars and trust. Their ship is small, but strong, camps incomplete, but their hearts aligned. One night, as storms threaten from the west and fear creeps into their lungs, a young navigator points to the sky. K there, he says, that curve of stars wasn't on the chart yesterday. And when the others look, they see it too, a boat etched in silver light. As they watch, the storm calms. The winds shift, the sails fill just enough, K, and the ship moves forward, not fast, not slow, but certain. No one cheers. No one speaks, but each sailor places their hand on the deck and breathes deeply. The sea has seen them, a remembered dot when they reach an island weeks later, one not marked on any map. They find a village that welcomes them with silent songs and symbols carved into doorways. The children draw waves in the sand. The elders smile knowingly, and one old woman points to a shelf inside the temple, where a long scroll rests, unlabeled, unfinished, waiting. The captain of the ship bows and whispers, "We've come home to something we never left." And the monks reply, "Yes, the sea calls, not because it is far, but because you are near enough to hear it." They stay for a while, repair their vessel, share their dreams. And when they leave again, they carry the wind differently, less like force, more like memory. The ocean welcomes them back with a different silence, not empty, but full of presence, recognition, and invitation. They no longer seek destinations. They follow, listening, because they know now. The sea does not carry answers. It carries remembering as the boat moves through golden dawn. One sailor places a hand to his chest and feels something pulse, not his heart, but something older, something deeper. And when he looks up at the sky, he whispers, "Thank you." And somewhere in the silence between stars, the boat constellation flickers once, just once, enough to be seen. The scroll is still growing. It lies open in a temple by the harbor. No guards, no signs, light and silence. People visit from far lands. They don't come to read, they come to feel. And when they leave, they often carry nothing, no books, no coins, just a change in how they breathe, a softness in how they look at the horizon, slowness in how they speak. Children still draw ships with no sails. Elders still tell stories with no words. And the tide still rolls in with the rhythm of memory. The scroll accepts every mark, from monks, from fishermen, from travelers who never speak their names. No mark is wrong. No mark is forgotten. For the sea holds all of it, and somewhere in a ship not yet built, a child will one day place their hand on the deck and feel something. Warm rise from below, not heat, not vibration, but story. And they will know not with their mind, but with their marrow, that they are not beginning a journey. They are continuing it. As long as there is wind, as long as there is water, as long as there are those who listen instead of speak, follow instead of chase, remember instead of explain, the voyage will go on, not in books, but in breath, in tide, in silence, in you.